Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, The Airport of the Future, Planning for Post-Pandemic Facilitation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Samantha Layton. I am the Industry Development Manager and Regional Airports Manager here at the AAA. Today's webinar will cover topics such as how airports can ensure the safety of passengers, airport users and staff while actively supporting industry recovery. Brett and Eric will consider what changes airports may consider over coming months, both in operations, user experience and facility choices. As always, the opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. I'm now going to show you a screenshot of your attendee control panel. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, you have an option menu item for questions. You can click on the question button and submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar, and I will ask Eric and Brett to answer these at the conclusion of the presentation. Also for noting, if you're interested in downloading today's handout, please click the handout section of your taskbar on the right to download that document. I'm pleased to introduce our presenters today, Brett Rees and Eric Creel. Brett leads International Engineering Design and Advisory Company, Aurecon's ANZ Aviation team, where he specialises in the management and development of privatised airports. Brett has led the master planning of numerous Australian airports and has undertaken extensive land use, airfield and terminal planning exercises for airports in Australia and New Zealand. Brett has previously held positions in both Australian and international airports. Eric manages Aurecon's technical aviation capability across Australia and New Zealand, across ANZ, Asia and the Middle East. Eric has more than 2 decades of experience as an airport development planner and strategist, including terminal design, airport master planning, concept designs, capital expenditure planning and airline consultation. He's led consultancy teams in Australia, Asia, the Middle East and Africa. Previously, Eric headed airport planning for the Airports Company, South Africa, and has worked at some of the largest hub airports in the world. These presentations take time to prepare, and I'd like to thank both Eric and Brett for preparing today's webinar. Welcome, Brett and Eric.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sam and the AAA. I hope everybody can clearly hear me and can see the screen. Good morning, everyone. It's really a great privilege for us to be partaking in this platform today. Both Brett and myself, before becoming professional consultants, spent many years on the other side of the fence, as it were, working with airport operators. And we like collaborating at platforms such as these in terms of working with our colleagues and friends in industry. And definitely in this difficult time, it's really essential that we all collaborate. I just want to get the screen going. Collaborating, finding industry solutions together. Unsurprisingly, there's much uncertainty in the industry at the moment, and much debate about the issues and the drivers and the solutions that face us as industry. I just want to make sure that everybody can see the screen. There are many drivers and solutions to the issues at the moment, and many of them are, of course, of non-technical nature. You know, we may have issues that range from the political, the socio-economic, and possibly even ethical questions at the moment, and certainly we don't anticipate getting into those today. But we can certainly, as an industry in these moments of uncertainty, we can identify those future uncertainties and at least rehearse alternative strategies that we can, as a community, deal with to cope with those unsure futures. So our team, Brett, myself, and some of the colleagues, Steen and David and the guys, have been working on focusing on and exploring and visualizing regulatory responses that can deal with these issues that we are confronted with, to support the government with relevant industry solutions. And that's why we so enjoy being here today. We know the AAA is also working on the very same thing. In terms of today's presentation, in working towards this new aviation landscape, we will today share with you near-term tactics, so things that's almost operational, and many of those you are very well familiar with and are exercising already. but also medium-term strategies that are available to the community that will lead the industry from recovery through all the way through to the eventual reform. We will be discussing them roughly following that sequence that you see on the screen. Firstly, we'll be looking at potential revisions and operations and in airport facilitation necessitated by the response to the virus. And from that, we can discern the focus areas around which industry can engage actively together with government and such. In the second half of today's discussion, Brett will take over, and he will take you through approaches in placing the passenger in the heart of the response, as well as taking you through some business expenditure changes that might be required to support the industry recovery. It's very important to note that the digital handout that you can see in your control panel closely resembles what we will be discussing today. That handout is basically an industry discussion paper that we've prepared that encapsulates and summarizes these issues that we are taking you through today. So we know that our industry is in quite a lot of pain. There's no question about that. It's evidenced on the screen. The industry fell really, really hard and fell really quickly. You can see there on the screen in a matter of a couple of weeks, IATA had to make several outlook revisions in really short succession. The last one you see on the screen is dating back from the 14th of April, and they've done more subsequently. The issue being that even IATA did not foresee the level to which the industry will have its bottom fall out, and there's certainly more pain to come. On the bottom, you see an extract. Again, you will see that in more detail in the handout done by our friends and colleagues in CAPA. This outlook published a few weeks ago shows one perspective of recovery for the industry in Australia. And you will notice that the domestic recovery rate is foreshadowed to outstrip that of international, and for well-known reasons associated with country risk, inbound quarantine challenges, we're all familiar, and the like. So we've really focused on the international sector. It is such an intrinsic part of the economy that it's an essential objective for us all to reintegrate Australian travel with that of the world, but do so in a responsible and risk managed approach. So the real questions we've been delving into is what are the business issues at stake here? What can airports, airlines and governments collectively focus on in terms of facilitating a new world? In exploring these recovery options, we've really looked at this simplified diagrammatic expression of the COVID-19 stages against likely domestic and international sector performance. It is, of course, diagrammatic and very stylized, so you can see that as nearly as mathematical as what you saw previously. But if you look at the top, you've got sort of four green bands of viral stages. The first one is when everybody goes into panic. There's this significant flare-up of infections, and then there's the invariable and predicted phase where the infection comes and goes, and then you've got waves and flare-ups and the like, and we are all painfully aware of that. And then eventually one reaches the new normal where the virus is in some level of containment. We overlaid on that. You can see that on the sort of blue boxes at the bottom, this with four aviation stages that sort of matches this. And again, you will see that in the electronic handout in much more detail. In short form, stage one is when the borders are completely closed and only repatriation, mercy and essential flight activity is taking place. We're all very, very well familiar with that, and we're exiting that phase now. Stage two would commence with the opening of domestic borders and sort of transition through to somewhere in that phase where the health requirements have been met such that some safe travel international zones can be opened up. Beyond that, in stage three and leading on to four, the new normal, the international traffic likely will be divided into trusted and less safe type of traffic routes. It's interesting to note that stage two sort of overlaps with that middle stage of turbulent periods of flare-ups, the waves of infection that we've seen and we've painfully experienced in Victoria and to a lesser extent in New South Wales. And although this diagram is barely a few weeks old, it is approximately at least accurate in the staging, the sequencing of these stages. But certainly the Victorian experience has painfully demonstrated that the uncertainty related to the health situation is quite significant still, and that flare-up may be quite higher. Regrettably, the Victorian situation has also taught us that although we're focusing on international facilitation in this piece, there may very well be some of those international facilitation approaches that if the situation becomes really dire domestically can also then be applied to interstate type of scenarios. Moving on to the next slide, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, have similarly divided the evolution of the situation into 5 stages from 0 to 4. This is more a focus on the country level of recovery to the virus situation. Very briefly, they were published by the Council for Aviation Recovery Task Force, or CART it's called. And these are stage 1 travel restrictions, we know that. Stage 1, 2 and 3 are the stages during which public health practices are in place at various levels, and then of course because of that being in the wider community also in aviation. And then stage 4 would be the sort of the perfect outcome when the pharmaceutical interventions are fully and readily available, but they still may need a set of residual measures and mitigations required to deal with the risk of future outbreaks. Very importantly, the stage 3 may be a case where vaccine is, for example, available, but not widely and not to all countries, or the vaccine may not be fully effective, or it may still be in a scenario where the vaccine needs to be repeated every X month, and there's some medical evidence that suggests it may be as little as 3-4 months at a time. If we summarize all of that, and this is again using the ICAO summary of the resumption factors, so looking at the health outlook on the left-hand side and the traffic resumption factors on the right. These are respectively public health agency guidelines that reflect this health situation you see on the left. And then importantly, what the government of various countries, states and such have to intervene in terms of responding to that health scenario. Third important step that Brett will touch on a little bit later is whether we can give the passenger the confidence to actually rejoin that journey and start traveling again. And then lastly, whether airports actually have the operational capacity to put in place the right measures to actually facilitate international traffic return. Now, we have the view that that is much harder to achieve in the smaller airports, and typically in a low demand scenario, the bigger airports actually do have sufficient floor space to be able to achieve that. Importantly, last point on this topic, ICAO also then strongly suggested that those stages 1, 2, and 3 should not be seen as one directional, and there may be requirement to continue to loosen and tighten some of these requirements depending on the health situation. And again, although not following directly the ICAO guidelines, is exactly what we've just experienced in Australia with caps on quarantine, caps on flights, and the like. So very relevant. So the COVID-19 has brought a whole heap of new operational needs, there's no doubt about that, and we've explored options that airports have available to them and that they can exercise to resonate with those ICAO country outlook steps that's been put forward. And these 4 focus areas that we'll be putting up on the screen, of course, would not be absolutely identical to every airport. Every airport is unique and we'll have to adequately tailor that to its unique circumstances. But ideally, these outcomes should be, of course, captured and governed by bilateral health agreements and regulations. And again, we know the Airports Association is working quite hard behind the scenes on things like that. So summarizing them very briefly, first focus area definitely is to understand the total passenger journey. And this is not only referring to the journey on board, it's referring to the journey from leaving your house to arriving at the other side at your destination, the total experience that the passenger may face. And again, Brett will touch on that a little bit later. If we examine that journey, we can already preemptively identify the adjustments that we may need to make down the track. It's an industry focus to really demonstrate to the powers that be that we can, in fact, as an aviation industry, reduce and manage the health risk through the measures that we do, put in place. Effectively doing that will contribute to effectively accelerating the return of traffic as well. It will make a direct contribution to that. And then lastly, the airports, of course, we all know have got a significant challenge in terms of assets that are now lying dormant or underutilized. They need to find a managed and a smooth recovery pathway out of all of this back to normalcy. Again, something that Brett will touch on a slide or two to follow. And then lastly, just echoing the good work that the AAA is already doing, is to prepare for, as an industry, and as an industry possibly inform the regulatory and government decisions that need to be made in order to recover the industry. And that's a thought that gets echoed by Mr. Gert van der Graaf from the Brisbane Airport Corporation. But definitely airports, airlines and government should collaborate, there's no doubt, but more importantly, find a staged recovery. So there's not a magic switch that should be pressed and off we go in terms of a silver bullet, as it were, to get things going. And similarly, Angela Gittens from the ACI World Council also suggests that we shouldn't think about a silver bullet, a single measure that will mitigate all the risks. We should be probably looking at an outcome-based or a layered approach, or a blended risk management approach to these sorts of things. Excuse me. So there's a whole menu of options available to industry. They are, again, just briefly summarized through a graphic up on the screen. Again, you can read up on the detail in our digital handout that is attached to this meeting. And they range from increasing processing rates to managing demand, increasing processing points, looking at contactless procedures and automation and the like. But really want to pay your attention, or make you pay attention to the bottom right-hand corner, where we've really focused on a risk management approach where we actually limit or manage the traveller's entry into the terminal itself, and thereby manage the risk. So it's very important to note that the slides you'll see in the next couple of slides is really rooted in an administrative risk management approach over and above all these current near-term operational interventions that you might be very well familiar with, such as sanitizing, social distancing, and the like. So we really try to look at sort of an administrative risk-based approach to everything. So the questions that one would want to answer through all of this is things like how not to cap traffic, which is currently the case, how not to sit with excessive quarantining imposition, which is quite a costly and risky affair in its own right. How to safely facilitate traffic in a scenario where a vaccine is really far off in future, or it's not fully effective, or it's not widely accessible to all countries in equal measure. How can we assemble these options to respond to that? So it's pretty clear that we need to have a response that deals with the variability in the response at different airports, that accounts for that, but still at least be elected from a standard sort of protocol, as ICAO and industry leaders are suggesting. So in the next slides, we'll be fairly quick about that in the interest of time, but again, it is available for you to read in the digital handout. We've just nominated alternative concept of operations for this future risk-based type of approach, and that incorporates all the other smaller operational interventions. So for example, we have not captured here things like logical sanitization and cleaning and hygiene and social distancing, but really those big facilitation steps that may have to change. On the left-hand side, you can see that we're really premising this on the point that there may be a need to, upon entry of the airport terminal, be subjected to some level of screening. It's extremely important to point out that that is a risk management activity, and it needs to be scalable, and it has to be scalable to respond to alternative scenarios. So in a post-vaccine world, fully effective and widely available vaccine, that type of check may be as simple as demonstrate a health visa of sorts and demonstrate that you've been vaccinated and good to go. Or on the other extreme of the scale, another bookend that might be if a vaccine is so far off that we really need to open the borders before it becomes fully effective, possibly even going to the extreme of doing some of these tests, including the laboratory tests at airport, make a passenger wait for a couple of hours before actually embarking on the flight. But the essence is to allow the passengers into the system once we have reached a level of confidence that they are indeed safe to inject into the travel system, as it were. Now, we've separated this into two processes, a standard and non-standard. So once you're good to go, as it were, to enter the system, your facilitation will almost be identical to what we've seen in the past, apart from these hygiene overlay that we've made mention of. There may, however, still be a requirement by certain countries and airlines to get into a very specific protocol. So in addition to this basic filtration of allowing you into the system, you may have to have a secondary level of screening, and for which we put forward that there needs to capability and possibly retained beyond COVID to have some sort of non-standard gate through which these passengers can be facilitated. The analogy would be very similar to our passengers that fly from Australia to the US from various ports would have to undergo certain tests and interviews at gate level. So the team, David and Steen and the guys have used a digital tool which we regularly use as a planning tool, and use that as a mock-up of capturing and visualizing some of these facilitation changes that you can see on the screen now. And again, quickly just taking you through those. This is for departures. So again, if it's a real low end type of intervention, think of a fully vaccinated type of community, one can probably do that inside the check-in or upon entry. In a low demand scenario, there may be more than enough space or spare capacity, one should say, to achieve that. If the health situation and the delays in vaccination demonstrate a more severe case, we may elect to do that outside the airport terminal and start decanting some of that into car parks, ground transportation centres, and possibly even hotel facilities on the land side. Now, of course, this is just a digital model, and every airport will have to think about exactly how they would introduce a concept like this in their specific typology and topography of their landscape. There will, as you would be aware, still be the need, notwithstanding the risk management approach, the need for increased queuing at check-in, security, immigration, and other processes just to maintain and account for the social distancing requirements as just good, prudent risk management. And then those sort of non-standard gates are just separated from the standard ones at the right and at the bottom, cut off in this image. That there may then have to be a secondary point where, for example, if you want to fly to Sweden, just take an example, you have to comply with the Sweden regulation and demonstrate a specific level of compliance in your paperwork. Now, outside Sweden is maybe not a good example, but I think you get the point. And those passengers may then be held and contained in a separate area for their facilitation. On arrivals, the process is just slightly the reverse. And again, you can go and read the detailed graphic when you manage to open the handout. But here it's quite important to point out that the differentiator is not what a different receiving country or a carrying airline may take. Now it's the Australian perspective, and it's managing the inbound risk. And so here we would separate those standard and non-standard gates between high risk and low risk flights, or high risk, low risk origins, or high risk, low risk airlines. And whether we've got a need based on health advice to treat them slightly separately. So if an airline is within that, as it's so much used, the bubble, they will be arriving through a standard gate, and then we still believe there may need to be some risk management associated with that, and that can be taken in the simple form of thermal testing or other symptomatic tests, and possibly even a quick swab test. as the person arrives in country, and thereafter going through the regular immigration process in baggage claim and customs. But for some flights arriving from those more risky origins and conditions, the initial primary screening may be a little bit more elaborate. It may be taking the form of a lot of interviewing, checking of paperwork. The origin of that passenger may have slipped through the net in some hub airport and the like. And therefore, at that point, may still have the retained capability of diverting a passenger like that off into the quarantine that we know today. But in essence, it should be of a much, much lower volume, because that passenger has cleared the paperwork hurdles, if you wish, at the origin of his flight. Again, expressing that as a visual using the digital mock-up. If you arrive from a high-risk gate, you will be confronted with being tested and screened for symptoms and administrative tests very early on arrival. Some airports already do that actually as early as still in the aircraft. Before you're allowed to disembark, they start with some level of thermal testing. And then it's important to then separate those passengers throughout the journey until they've managed to clear all the border control and other controls that are required in the journey. So for the normal passengers or the low risk passengers, excuse me, again, following the risk managed approach, it probably still should retain some level of thermal imaging, some level of sentinel testing, or just random pulling off people and doing some interviews and the like, just to keep a tab on the origins and the paperwork of those passengers. But again, bear in mind what you see here is a scenario where those passengers would be flying from a destination where there is already a reciprocal health agreement or a bilateral arrangement that makes sure that the risk is indeed very, very low. There may be a need to separate duty-free, unfortunately, in many airports, depending on whether they have the capability to separate physically the arrivals and departures areas. That is not always achievable at some airports and might actually require some trickery and development and remodeling of facilities. So that may be a challenge. But in most cases, I can suggest that it could be as simple as just a tensile barrier. You just want to make sure that these passengers are socially kept apart until the government is comfortable with letting them into the country. Similar to arrivals, there may be a need to introduce social distancing requirements at immigration and other types of control cones. And there's also the potential requirement to revisit e-gate use, although some airports have made quite a lot of progress in terms of using contactless approaches to that, although they still need to fully certify and demonstrate the efficacy of that. There may be a staff requirement and to still maintain social distancing baggage claim, particularly for the high-risk flights, because they're not fully cleared to enter the country. That may burden the airports with some additional operational costs. Excuse me. We have indicated the need to have an external bag sortation or disinfecting facility, and that may be induced by the fact that these red or high-risk passengers may have quite a lot of in-system time, to get through their various tests and interviews and the like, and therefore those bags cannot progress or proceed directly to the baggage claim area, in which case there needs to be some sort of holding area, or it may even extend into those bags requiring to be disinfected. We've indicated in this digital model to be located outside the airport terminal, but depending on case by case, it may equally be internalized or in a location that is sensible at that specific airport location. Importantly, we have, similar to ICAO, have recommended that these passengers be kept apart all the way through until they actually enter the land side. And the reasoning behind that is the border force and the customs officials and the like may still have the requirement to open a retrieved bag at that point and be sure that there's no retained biohazard that they need to deal with. So quite a division throughout the entire process. But again, ICAO has clearly recommended that it does not have to go all the way to full physical separation if the health risk is not as severe. So again, a scalable risk management approach. I will now hand over to Brett. And so far, looking at this, we've been looking at operational concepts and things that the industry can focus on and work together. And now we'll switch gears and to start really talking about how to integrate these passenger experience and business decision making to support and sustain these concepts that we've put on the table. So, Brett, over to you.
Thank you, Eric. So what Eric's described to everyone is the passenger journey and the concepts of operations. In this next section, what I'll take you through is a couple of slides on user-centered design and that perspective, looking at what does a future terminal look like through a user lens, and then I'll look at and then I'll have a conversation around scenario and strategy in terms of sustaining capital from an airport's perspective and essentially staying in business in a post-COVID world. So if we're looking at a future terminal and what does that future terminal look like, and we're starting to visualize what aspects will change as we move into this new normal, which I'll call, you've got the reconfiguration of queuing and you've got the layouts changing. You need to have clear wayfinding and signage, and we're talking about stickers on floors. I call it the Woolworths of applications in this very light touch approach to the initial stages. That of course then moves into a more substantive changes and scenarios as you go through. The important thing though is in designing and looking at these aspects is to make sure that you keep in mind the end user and what are they feeling, what are their emotions, etc. as they move through, and how do you maintain a light touch and I'll call it a friendly touch, such that you are considering the user on the journey. The other aspects to this, of course, is having additional staff to help facilitate the divesting of prohibited items so that you don't have the constantly going to and fro through screening and having to re-screen. It's all about minimizing the touch points as much as humanly possible, temporary barriers and screens, etc., to maintain that physical distance, and then you move into the more sophisticated aspects in terms of immigration and looking at automation and biometrics and the like. So then we sort of start to think about, in the next slide, we start to think about the passenger behaviour, and where we take the approach that we need to explore and understand the persona of the passenger, such that we are cognizant of the what, the who, the how, the capability, the support network that would be coming along, and the emotional state and drivers of the passenger coming through this journey. These sorts of journeys can be quite burdensome and can create quite a lot of anxiety. And in returning to a new normal, it's important to have the user at the centre of these kind of designs so that they are more relaxed. In fact, when they get through screening and they enter into the departure lounge, you'd like to think that the user has become more relaxed and then can start to orientate themselves and start considering spending a little bit on retail and food and beverage, because that's obviously a very important aspect of returning to the new normal, is obviously getting the certain commercial revenues and everything else kicking again, so that airports can maintain their businesses into the future. So it's all about reducing anxiety and trying to create a more relaxed physical environment for the end user in their space. So in the next slide, what I'll explore here is, as we move through uncertain times, there's certain things that we can and cannot control. In fact, we don't have a lot of control on this journey in a COVID world. But what we can identify and control is our strategies and our strategic responses to this journey. And in one aspect, we talk about sustaining capital, which is the capital spend, a large amount of many disparate items that need to be spent to, I call it staying in business, so to maintain compliance, etc. So as we move through the various stages in our transition to COVID, initially we're going to have, as we are in this stage and are starting to transit from, is essential freight and repatriation, but mostly borders are closed. In the stages 2 and 3, our international borders open, but there will still be an element of retained capability, we believe will be required to maintain a safe post-COVID environment. So in the next slide, and also, I should also point out that in that transition, there is a need to consider the sustaining capital spend and what does that spend look like, and what are the decisions we need to make. So sorry, Eric, into the next slide. So what actually happened, obviously, is when borders shut down and aviation industry stopped, we had a large amount of capacity capital programs in train that were pretty much suspended. So there was a cliff, if you like. However, post that, there is still a large amount of sustaining capital spends around risk, around new risk mitigation procedures, the occupational health and safety, essential services and maintenance, compliance, that has to continue. And these smaller CapEx items in themselves create a portfolio of CapEx spend that we can now look at and decide, well, how do we spend this money? You know, what are the opportunities going forward? Is there capital programs out there that we can actually spend money on that we could not spend money on before, purely because, you know, traffic numbers have dropped? So in the next slide, we start to think about the scenarios and the scenario responses. So the scenarios is essentially the elements where we don't have very much control, but we have some limited control. But what we do have control of is the strategies and the strategic options and what that might look like given the scenarios that we expect will transpire. And then ultimately we can then overlay that with the business performance objectives, criteria, goals, and make sure that it aligns so that it's a whole of business approach to going forward in this post-COVID world, if I can call it that. So in the next slide, I'll just quickly explore the scenarios and just take you through a simple model that we use just to I guess, show and demonstrate the kind of scenarios that may eventuate. There could be scenarios within scenarios, but in this slide, we've nominated 4 key scenarios. If you're looking at the vertical slide at the top, where we're saying, well, what happens if we return to trend levels of growth and trend levels of movements in aviation? At the bottom, we never return to that trend level whatsoever. And then in the horizontal axis to the left-hand side, we have a quick return as opposed to a slow and more gradual return. So if we then look at the various scenarios in the various sectors, we can see what that looks like from a graphic perspective. You've got the top left-hand corner, A, where we return very quickly to trend level aviation. At the bottom in B, we never return, but we return reasonably quickly. In the top right hand, we return quite slowly, but we return back to our trend and growth levels. And then in the bottom right hand corner, we don't return. The probability with all of these, it's very hard to predict, but one would have to say that the probability is more so in the right-hand side of that sector. So now what I'll do is I'll quickly say, so those are the scenarios, those are the profiles that we're looking at. Now we'll go through the strategic and strategy options that might therefore present ourselves, the stuff that we actually have control over. So in the next slide, this is a stylistic approach, and obviously this we're talking about airports as a whole, not just terminal facilities, but we're looking at three essential strategies here. We're looking at essentially a large mothballing strategy where not much of the facilities are left open, but that we bring them on in an incremental manner as we recommission the asset as a strategy, as growth returns and as passenger numbers return and as aircraft movements return to the new normal. In the second strategy, we have more of the asset maintained and operational with the mothballing of other assets, but we're essentially sweating the asset as much as we humanly can, and in terms of capacity as well, until a point where we then have the big bang at the end and we re-establish the asset. And in the third strategy, this is essentially running the asset with least numbers, but continuing to maintain the entire asset on the way through as we enter into growth. Now, each one of these has a different risk profile, compliance profile, and cost profile. So that then allows us to consider those strategic options given the scenarios that we believe might eventuate, so that we can make informed and strategic decisions as we move forward. So in the next slide, I will then have a look at how this translates into business performance and what does that actually mean and what does that look like. So in our Aurecon dashboard, we overlay a number of criteria across a business. Those criteria are financial, commercial, operational, stakeholder, network, and risk. The financial aspect is all about spending the right money at the right time on the right assets to make sure the business cases stack up and that you have a predictable capital spend going forward and a maintainable capital spend going forward. The commercial aspects is all about bringing the right revenue on and maximizing revenue so that you have the revenue arriving at the right time to maintain a profitable business, and that you're also keeping your customers happy, etc. From an operations perspective, it's all about risk, safety, compliance. There'll be COVID compliance as well as normal airport operating compliance matters to be considered, and all of that needs to be considered when we're looking at a sustaining capital spend. A stakeholder perspective, and this then relates right back to the user-centered and looking at it through a user's lens, level of service and making sure that we have a certain level of service that satisfies our end users and that maintains the asset at the same time. And then, of course, there's the old competitive aspect to this. And how do we position ourselves as businesses to get that competitive edge and potentially be that airport that opens up first in this sector and then starts to derive those benefits earlier than, say, perhaps others. And then finally, obviously, we need to look at risk. And what does that mean? So asset performance, and under asset performance, there's a couple of others you could overlay. There's compliance risk and the like, and there's cost risks. So having taken all of those things together and established the business performance criteria, we then have the strategy outlaid and overlaid and a path forward. So what does this mean in terms of what does this look like, and what does this mean in terms of performance for a post-COVID world? So in the next slide, we look at the the planning response, and we look at the overlay of the various areas of the business and how this then translates into better financial decisions, better budgeting decisions, making sure you've got capital available from a planning manager's perspective, making sure that he's included and incorporated the asset management requirements within his development program. Maintenance is all about obviously maintaining the assets and keeping them operational. From an engineering perspective, you've got better data, you're able to better analyse and understand the robustness of the assets, if I can use that term. From an environment, obviously in compliance perspective, you're looking at your mitigations and your reduction in risk in those spaces, and operationally your level of service. So in the next slide, there are three key principles. Simply, I'll summarise them as systems, pathway, and partnership. So setting up the right systems so that we can process passengers safely, securely, comfortably. And then from principle 2, that we have an asset pathway, as I've just described, that assists us in the I call it the path of least resistance, if you like, and then we also, in terms of partnerships, I guess in these uncertain times, and as we progress through this pandemic, there will be many opportunities for us to work as airports, as airlines, and with government to actually achieve a flight path back to aviation, a flight path back to the new normal. And we see these as the three underlying principles that will help and assist the aviation industry get back on its legs. There are no absolute certainties in this world, but this is just a presentation on what a post-COVID world might look like. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have a couple of questions. The first one says, and it's geared towards regional airports, the introduction of additional health and permit screening has impacted the operations with limited space in the arrivals area. Have you seen any examples of well-designed additional arrival screening zones?
Sorry, can you just repeat the last? I missed the last part of that question. You just broke up there at the end.
Oh, sorry. I'll get it back up on the screen again. Sorry. So I'll just read the whole thing again. Particularly in regional airports, the introduction of additional health and permit screening has impacted the operations with limited space in the arrivals areas. Have you seen any examples of well-designed additional arrival screening zones?
Well, again, like mentioned before, it's something that's identified by ICAO as well, and that is that it's the capacity to deal with this is probably much harder for the smaller airports compared to the big ones, because the big ones may have a very big customs hall or an immigration hall or an arrival screening point, and because of the complete and utter drop in traffic, there's so low a demand that they've got oodles of free space to just reconfigure a little bit and get going with the facilities. And ICAO also recommends and recognizes that it's much harder for regional or smaller airports. So myself, I haven't seen specific designs responding to this because it's so new. And that's one of the big contributing factors why we believe a risk management approach is so much better route to take for these smaller airports as opposed to going down the avenue of spending big money on facility expansions and the like before they, to gain that space that's so hard to achieve.
Okay, great. We also have some other questions. What effects do you foresee in the passenger experience, and do you think these changes might turn passengers off travelling?
Yeah, perhaps I'll touch on that one. Yeah, so look, there will be more touch points for the passenger on this journey. The passenger will have to allow more time. Traditionally, you'd arrive an hour or 30 minutes before a domestic flight. You may need to allow yourself another half hour. If you're traveling internationally, it may be 3 or 4 hours rather than two hours before an international flight, simply because the processes will be what they will be. But I think that through a proper user-centered design approach, that you're able to minimise the anxiety and minimise the annoyance, such that the journey for the passenger is as less burdensome as possible. IATA actually said that it actually did a survey of passengers, and 14% of passengers said they would return to flying straight away. And of those 14, a total of 60% said that within 2 months, so that includes the 14%, but 60% in 2 months would return to travel. And there was 40% that said they're going to wait 6 months or longer. So, yep, I do see I do see us returning to the new normal, if I can call it that. We will quickly get used to it, and I think we will return to trend growth.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting that you mentioned that survey. The AAA did one in consultation with some of our major airports. We were surveying domestic passengers who basically said that their confidence once they travelled was up to 80% higher once they saw the new processes in place, once they saw that airports were interested in protecting their health, or airports and airlines. So that was really interesting to see that although many were nervous about the new processes, once they saw them in place and once they saw that they were, for the betterment of their health, 80% said that they would travel again within the next, 1 to 2 months. So really interesting.
Thanks,
we have another question.
Maybe just quickly add to that, if I may. We have seen evidence as recently as the last fortnight that in Europe, the reverse is also true. So what's happening in Europe is that different countries and different airlines would take different approaches to this. So it's not consolidated, it's not coordinated. And that's actually induced anxiety again. So people would get onto the plane not knowing what to expect on the other side, as it were. And so again, coming back to the point, if industry works together and brings some level of constancy to these interventions, may actually reduce the anxiety as well.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the AAA is working quite closely with many of our working groups to ensure that national consistency, not just in Australian airports, but actually the region, so New Zealand as well, given that trans-Tasman bubble, trying to allay the fears of passengers once they get to the other side. So another question, do you believe these changes will become permanent?
There's an acceptance by ICAO. You probably remember seeing that on one of the slides of stage, I think stage 4 as I call it, that there will have to be a retained capability to deal with, right now we're dealing with COVID-19, but there may be a COVID-22 and a COVID-27, who knows. So similar to what happened in 9/11 and terrorism in aviation in the 70s, there's a response, and some of these practices become a normal and permanent feature of our landscape. I personally would say it would depend on how severe the health situation pans out to be over the next 6 to 12 months. In other words, again, if a very effective vaccine becomes widely available and widely accessible, that retained capability will arguably be much smaller than a scenario where it's really runaway train and they can't contain. There's a real big challenge, and we have to sort of live with it for many years to come, in which case that retained capability will be much bigger. But there's widely an accepted opinion that there will be some level of permanency. Yes.
Mm-hmm. With a COVID overlay, what are the impacts or opportunities to airport landside estates?
That's an interesting question. In to answer that, I guess the changes may mean that when you're travelling, that passengers and friends and relatives will have to leave you at the gate, so to speak, or at the screening point, so to speak. So maybe in that kind of environment, the chance to get there a little bit early and then spend some time in those areas might be one aspect. I think, though, that generally airports are destinations because airports are airports. They're transport hubs, and so they become less attractive, if I can say that. So in terms of the wider airport estate, it becomes just like any other estate. It's not to say that there's still not demand, and there's still a freight aspect and all of those sorts of things. Like, so I'm guessing what I'm saying is I'm not 100% sure what the impacts would be. I think that for some aspects the impacts would be negative, but for others they'd be positive. Sorry, that's a bit vague, but yeah.
No, but it makes sense though.
One of the ideas that some people have mentioned is because of air freight now being so much active in movement of goods between countries, maybe there's an aspect that says move some of the retail interface points to the airport itself. So the airport becomes the point of actually accessing the retail goods as they arrive in the country. So think of your DFO being right at the front door of the terminal. So there are probably landscape changes and options available to us if this current scenario really perpetuates for many months to come.
And our final question before we wrap up. You touched on arrivals health screening measures. Do you see this as being an airport airline responsibility or government health responsibility?
I was hoping to dodge that question. Yeah, you did hear me say that we would not want to get into the legal and the socioeconomic and the political aspects of that, but so that's clearly a question that needs to be answered before any progress is made. In fact, when we went on our sort of doing the rounds with the airport ourselves, as we do in a normal part of our business, we found that question was actually more critical on the departure side. In other words, who should be taking the responsibility of sending a passenger off into a journey and guaranteeing that there is indeed some safety. But I'm going to try and dodge that bullet. It's probably a regulatory question more than a facilitation question.
That's fair enough. So we will there. Eric and Brett, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. Today's webinar recording will be available in Airport Alert and emailed to everyone that joined us today. The AAA does encourage everyone to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered in the 2020 webinar series. You can email Erin at events@airports.asn.au. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for joining us. Brett and Eric, great presentation, very informative. And thank you for taking the time to not only put the presentation together, but to come along and present for our members. Our next webinar being held 5th of August, and it will be presented by Nick Law from IVM Group, with the topic being Manage Your Grass, Manage Your Risk. So everyone enjoy the remainder of your afternoon and week. Please stay safe. To all our people living in Melbourne and Victoria, please, that goes doubly for all of you down there. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.